if we go to Jesus in the Gospels, when the disciples struggle to understand a philosophical concept, if you will, or spiritual concept, Jesus told them a story. So who is your neighbor? Well, let me tell you a story about neighbors. Why does he do that? Why does God choose to communicate with us through the written word in the form of story? Because he's hardwired us. Mm-hmm. There's something in us that we just get it. We understand story. We need story.
Today's guest is Dr. Cheryl Collier, Professor of English and Associate Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Science at North Greenville University. Dr. Collier has been teaching undergraduate writing and literature courses for over 3 decades. She holds a Bachelor of Arts from Lander University and a Master of Arts and a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Georgia. So you've spent 25 years at North Greenville, built a career here. Is that something that you always had in mind? Was that the plan?
Absolutely not. First, I had no plan to teach. And it's so funny, and I always tell my students this, as a senior in college, when people would ask me what I wanted to do with my major, my first response was, I don't know, but I will not teach. I don't want to teach. I don't want to be a teacher. I will not be a teacher. I really thought that I would do something in writing, maybe journalistic writing. I loved feature writing, that style. Maybe marketing, but I was leaning toward journalism, but I absolutely knew I did not want to teach. Toward the end of this first semester of my senior year, still didn't have a plan, and I started really feeling the Lord pulling me toward teaching. I was very resistant. I didn't want to teach high school, and I thought if I taught, I would want it to be older people, but I didn't want to teach high school. There's nothing wrong with that. My high school teachers were very influential in a very good way on me, but that's just not where my heart was leading. And some of my professors in college started talking to me about teaching college, and that was, to me, totally out of left field. It was not something I desired to do. It was not something that I had the money to do. I knew that I would have to go to grad school. I was barely making it through 4 years of college. I didn't have money to go to grad school. But the more they talked about it and the more I prayed about it and really started surrendering my will, the more I felt the Lord was leading me in that direction. So in the literally 9th hour, I had almost missed the deadlines for applying and getting assistantships. I just knew that's the direction the Lord was leading, and he opened doors for me to go to go to grad school, and I haven't looked back since then.
What made it stick? What are some of the parts about teaching that you've come to really love?
I really started to think about all the jobs I'd had in college, a different job every summer. The one consistent that I absolutely enjoyed, and it didn't make any sense to me, but the one consistent was I loved tutoring. And I had been asked my freshman year to tutor the men's basketball team. And I had also been asked to tutor students in Western Civ because I was doing well in the class. And I loved it. And especially tutoring the athletes was sometimes difficult. They didn't necessarily want to be in college. You know, everybody was going pro. They didn't necessarily see the need to be in college. This was just a means to an end. They thought they'd be there a year or two, and then they would be in the NBA. And they were very resistant and very difficult to tutor sometimes. But I loved it. I loved every bit of it. And I really, the Lord just started helping me to see some connections between what I enjoyed, my passions, and what I felt like I was pretty good at, and his calling. So that kind of solidified it for me. When those doors to grad school opened, it felt miraculous to me. The finances were provided. That was very much a miraculous thing for me because, again, it's not something I had planned on, and my family couldn't afford for me to go to college or to go to grad school. But everything the doors just opened. The finances, everything just fell into place. And I knew that I would enjoy advanced study of literature. So that wasn't an issue. And when I got into my graduate program, I mean, it was amazing. I loved everything about it. So, and they had a really good program for teaching graduate students how to teach. They had an apprenticeship program that was a year long, a lot like going through observations and student teaching on the secondary level, and a lot of mentoring for teaching. And so the Lord just laid it all out there, put everything in the right order, and it just all worked out. And I've never looked back. I've loved it since then.
And I come from, my family's full of teachers, and they really are special people because you do have to relate and communicate and love on a lot of different people from various backgrounds, various levels of how they got there. How have you noticed that, and how do you kind of take an interest in the student, build those relationships that result in better learning opportunities?
I think I realized after some teaching experiences how much I really had a passion for working with students. So I started teaching Sunday school when I was probably 18, and I enjoyed teaching the high schoolers in Sunday school, and it just kind of evolved from there. I noticed in the classroom that I tended to gravitate, even in my tutoring, I gravitated toward the underdog, the student who was struggling, the student who didn't necessarily see him or herself as a great student. And I love those moments, those sort of epiphanies for them, those light bulb moments where things started to click and they could see, hey, I can do this. I can be a good student. I can work harder and I can do better. I also found that, like any teacher, it's frustrating when you have students who are struggling, who aren't doing well, and honestly, who just are checking boxes and don't necessarily seem to care about your class. That's frustrating, but it was never frustrating to a level that I didn't want to do it anymore, and I saw that as a challenge and, try to reach as many students as you possibly could. I just enjoyed interacting with students. Teachers made a huge difference in my life, and I think most teachers would probably tell you the same thing. Teachers made a huge difference in my life, and it was a growing realization that this is ministry and that this is a way that you can really touch someone's life. It's also a way that you can touch students spiritually who don't necessarily desire that spiritual touch or that spiritual discussion. And so the more I taught, the more there were moments where the Lord would just open possibilities for me to talk to students about spiritual things. And I found that to be very, very encouraging. So yeah, it really was a process. When I finished my master's program, I wanted to teach for a couple of years, get some experience, then go back and do a PhD. And I was very committed to only staying out for 2 years. I did not want to get in a situation where life happened and then it's really hard to go back. And I fell in love with teaching. Teaching as an instructor, teaching freshman comp mostly, lowest person on the totem pole for sure. And I was in a huge research institution, so I definitely, as an instructor, was not viewed by the senior faculty as anything special. And that was great because you could just kind of fly under the radar and you could just teach. And I really enjoyed that. And so that sort of solidified for me that this is exactly where I was supposed to be. This is exactly what God was calling me to do.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier you had always been interested in studying advanced literature. Do you think that's something that maybe intimidates students? Is it an intimidating thing to bring to for others to come to love?
I think so. And I think, honestly, when I look back, I don't know why I wasn't more intimidated than I was. I was intimidated, and I definitely struggled with imposter syndrome, that feeling of, you're not smart enough, you're not good enough to do this. Everybody else is smarter than you. Everybody else has a stronger background than you. And I came from a small 4-year liberal arts college.
Mm-hmm.
And I was suddenly in this lion's den of a huge university with probably more students in the graduate program in English than were in my university as an undergraduate. And I kept feeling like, you're competing with people who are coming from huge, major research universities. And I struggled a little bit with that feeling of, I don't know that I belong here. I don't know that I can do this. And I would pray about it. Lord, give me the strength, give me the wisdom, help me to do this. And I remember the Holy Spirit just really speaking to me that my mindset was wrong, that I was not in competition with anybody, that there was no competition, that I was there to get an education. It didn't matter who those other people were or where they came from or what their backgrounds were. What mattered was A, that he had called me there, B, that he had put me in a position that I was extremely well equipped. And what I noticed when I started making friends and talking to people is that even though most of them came from huge universities, their educational experience a lot of times didn't match mine, but the positive was on my side, not on theirs, because I was in a program that was very rigorous. And I didn't even realize how rigorous it was until I was away from it. When we started to talk about, well, what classes did you have as an undergrad? And what classes did you have to take? And what was required in your program? And what was required in mine? And I had so much more in-depth study of literature with really great professors, really strong professors, very much a one-on-one investment of professor to student. A lot of my fellow graduate students in my cohort had not had that. Mm-hmm. They had been in huge classes where the professor didn't even know who they were. There was no personal interest. There was no personal involvement and no personal help for them to move forward. And I experienced that in class after class after class after class as an undergrad. And so I really understood in those moments that I had an advantage that I didn't even know that I had. And so that some of that imposter syndrome and that feeling that you have to compete with other people, I just let go of that. And I really focused on just learning and growing and developing as much as I could. Also, I think the Lord blessed me with some great, great professors in my graduate program who cared about us as individuals and took an interest in us as individuals, helping us to learn and grow and develop and preparing us, not just to move through graduate school, but for the job market, for getting a job, for eventually being in our own classroom and being the person in control of that classroom. So it was a great experience.
Who are some writers that have shaped you? Like, where do you draw inspiration, influence? What are some of the things you've enjoyed reading?
Well, anyone who knows me will not be surprised by this answer. William Faulkner is by far my favorite author, the most influential. I love T.S. Eliot. I love the modernists. I said this in chapel and people laughed at me, but I love the depression of the modern period. I love how these guys and ladies were just struggling with a different time, a different era. They felt like their bearings had been ripped away in many instances, and they were struggling to figure out this new world, what it meant, what their place was in this new world. So I'm very much a modernist. I love Faulkner, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Eliot, Zora Neale Hurston, some of the modernists in the Harlem Renaissance. That's my favorite time period. But there are others. I love Ernest Gaines, a writer that maybe not many people outside of Southern literature have heard of. Absolutely adore Flannery O'Connor. So I could go on and on.
No. What attracts you to that style of writing? Is it just knowing when the work was written and what was maybe going on in the world at that time? But what attracts you to that more depressive feeling of writing, and what is it? What does it offer to the person reading that maybe others don't?
I do not like being depressed, so that's not it. I think that. So I have learned over the years as a student of literature that I also love history. And if I could go back to undergrad and I could do things differently, I would either be a history minor or I would double major in history and English. But I love that era because it's so much connected, as all literature is, but it's so connected to the history of what was happening in the world at the time. And I think what attracts me to these writers, even though their writing can be depressing and nihilistic, and they were certainly grappling and struggling with their humanity and their place in the world and their place spiritually, I think what I really love about this literature is that you can so clearly see the struggles of the human condition in that literature. I mean, in all literature, but particularly you can see the struggles of humanity at that time through the literature that was written during the time period. And I say the literature is depressing because they are struggling with issues of identity. Who am I, and what is my place in the world, and who is God, and where is God, and does God care? Many of them drew the wrong conclusion that God doesn't care, that there is no God, that we're just in this all by ourselves. But what we see in their literature is the end, a very real, raw depiction of the state of humanity without God. So I think that's what I love about it. And it's so easy to see the lack of a spiritual foundation and the impact that that had on that generation of humans, of writers, of just people in general. And I think it's that grappling with identity and who God is and spiritual identity, and then the realization, maybe not by them, but for us as readers, that humanity without God, without that spiritual foundation is lost, truly lost. And when we read some of that modern literature, I think of Eliot's The Wasteland or The Hollow Men, which is just this raw depiction of humanity without God. And we can contrast that with our relationship with Him. This is what we have without God versus understanding that there is a God in heaven who loves us, who cares for us, who's personal to us, who there's a God who died for our salvation, and it's individual. It's for each one of us individually. He would have come and He would have died. He would have suffered. He would have taken on the burden of sin for any of us, if it had only been just one of us who needed Him to do that. And we contrast that with the writing of the moderns and where they are. Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises, depicting these characters who've rejected God and where they are, where they end up. That's, I think, a huge contrast, and it's so easy to see God at work and why it's important for us to understand who He is and the relationship that we have with Him and how He feels about us and what we have if we don't make that connection. I think that's probably why I love modern literature so much.
How much does Scripture give us the blueprint for good storytelling? What sort of links to, when you're trying to describe how to tell a good story, you're trying to show maybe students what that looks like, how much can we do to point back to Scripture and say, this is how it's done?
There's so much. I feel like as English teachers, we probably have an unfair advantage here at North Greenville teaching, and that integration of faith and learning that we're all striving for. We probably have an unfair advantage because it's almost impossible for us to teach without having that discussion. And especially teaching literature or teaching storytelling, I often talk to my students about this, that God is the ultimate creator. And he created us in his image, and it bears the reason that if he created us in his image, that there will be a creative impulse in us. He's the ultimate world builder. He's the ultimate storyteller. So, of course, there's in us both a need and a desire to tell story, but there's also embedded in us from our creation a gravitation towards story, an understanding that occurs through story that doesn't occur in any other way. So it's very easy for us to make those connections between God as storyteller. Dr. Fant's written a book that we've used in our English classes. I use in my senior seminar class called God as Author. And he's making those connections about God as the creator and human beings as being creative in the image of the one who created them. And so, yeah, it's pretty easy to make those connections. And he makes the case in his book, and I think it's 100% true, that the story, the biblical story of creation, fall, and redemption is the story of all of humanity. And when we tell stories and when we teach story, we see the repetition of that biblical story. We all want to know who we are, how we got here, how are we created, and for what purpose. We all struggle with the aftermath of the fall. We all struggle with sin and the impact that that has on our lives. And we all need and desire and search for redemption in some form, whether we are doing that knowingly and we search for it spiritually, or we're trying to find redemption and healing in a bottle or in relationships or in money or in our children. We're still searching for redemption. And so when we as humans tell stories, we tell stories out of the impetus of the one who created us. And when we study stories and we read stories, again, we're looking at that pattern of creation, fall, redemption. Also, God hardwired us. And if you think about it, my students and I laugh about this a lot because I'll say this. Think about how we study the Bible, we read the Bible. There are books of the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, that if we're being honest, most of us shy away from, right? What are those books? They're the books that are not infused with story. When's the last time you just got excited over Leviticus? Like, when's the last time you got excited over Numbers?
Yeah.
And it's because there's not a lot of storytelling. What are the books we gravitate toward? Even in areas of the Bible that we may struggle to understand, it's where a story is told, right? If you look at Paul in the New Testament, in his missionary journeys, what is he doing over and over and over, whether he's in Corinth or Ephesus or wherever, right? Whether he's preaching to the churches in Galatia, what is he doing? He tells the story over and over of his salvation, of his redemption, of the need for Christ over and over and over and over. He's telling a story, and as he tells a story, we get it, we understand. If we go to Jesus in the Gospels, when the disciples struggle to understand a philosophical concept, if you will, or spiritual concept, Jesus told them a story. So who is your neighbor? Well, let me tell you a story about neighbors. Why does he do that? Why does God choose to communicate with us through the written word in the form of story? Because he's hardwired us. There's something in us that we just get it. We understand story. We need story.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting concept to think about because I do think about where it's ingrained in all of us. And maybe you think back on your life and you think, I've gone through this thing. Maybe there's redemption, but I don't see it yet. Maybe there's this craving that people have for their life, or that it would get better, that there would be some sort of happy conclusion to everything that they've been through. How do you help students or young people or just people in general, how do you help them see that, first of all, that nature is given to us by God, but also that He's provided that conclusion for us, that He's given us this this great hope of what this life is all about. I just think about all the people that might be searching for that and haven't found it yet.
Well, it's in His Word. It's in His Word, and His Word is a story, and it embodies that same pattern, that same organization. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, and it's not that there's an end to God or an end to us, but there's an end of the story. And I think about our current day. In so many ways, it is a distressing time to be alive. And you feel like everything, all the stability, all that we have known to be true, it's being shaken in so many ways, politically and in every other way. If we just look at what's happening in our country and throughout the world with the crime wave, political unrest, what's recently happened in Venezuela, what's happening in Israel, just in America, all over the world, right? And you can despair and feel like, what a terrible time to be alive. It's so scary, it's so distressing. But we know, because God has told us what the end of the story is. And I think that gives us hope. Hope for eternal redemption, but also hope for redemption in this life. And I think connecting all of us, but young people especially, to that ultimate story, I think we have to go back to the book. We have to go back to the Bible. And throughout the Old Testament, I in my personal devotional time, I've been spending some time back in the Old Testament. It's been a while since I've done that. And had trudging through those books that sometimes are not that much fun to read. And so I'm reading in Judges right now. I'm studying in Judges. And there's this pattern over and over and over again. God tells Israel when they finally make it to the promised land, if you will keep my commandments, if you will stay away from the gods of the people whose land you're about to inhabit, then I am going to be your God. I will bless you. I will take care of you. But if you don't, and at the beginning or at the end of Numbers, there's a litany of things, blessings if you obey me, curses if you don't obey. And of course, Israel goes into the promised land, and Judges is a series of, they obeyed God when they had good judges, they disobey God when they don't, and they're overtaken by the enemy. And it's over and over and over and over. And you think, okay, what is it that I can learn today for me from that story? Well, of course, when I look at their story, Israel's story, and their failures and that repetition, I see several things. I see that God was really frustrated at them. I just finished reading about Gideon, and what's about to happen next, I know, is when Gideon dies, they're going to fall right back into their sin. And God gets so frustrated. And there are times where in this part of the Bible, but also in the journey through the wilderness for the Israelites, there are so many times where God will say, I'm just done with you. I'm done. That's it. I'm giving you over to these other people. They can destroy you. I'm finished. And Israel will cry out in repentance, and God will take them back. And it happens again and again and again. And I think, well, what is the story? What can I learn from that? What can I learn from the Old Testament? I can learn that God is faithful. I see that He's faithful. I see that no matter what we do, no matter how much we fail, He's still faithful. No matter how hard a situation, no matter how difficult the journey, no matter what a people go through, he is faithful and he will always be faithful. And I can apply that to my own life. So I think that biblical story, and we really have to get back to just basics, making sure that we and that the students we teach and that our children understand the truth of God's word, the infallibility of God's word, the faithfulness of God, no matter what we go through, no matter what circumstances, no matter how hard and how bad, helping them to understand, again, from the story in the Bible, creation, fall, redemption. We live in a sin-cursed world. One lesson that the Lord taught me in a difficult way, I lost my oldest brother right after I started graduate school, and it was so tough. And I asked why. I wanted to know why. Why is this happening? He was 33. He had a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old at the time. Why is this happening? Why are you taking him? The Lord never answered that question. To this day, he has not answered that question. But this is what he made very clear to me, that he is faithful. He'll be faithful to all of us, and he has been. And that there's some things that are a mystery as a result of the sin-cursed world that we live in. It's a mystery to us. We may never understand, but ultimately, I can trust the God of the universe because I know he's good. I know he's faithful. I have all kinds of examples in my own personal life, but I have examples in his word of his goodness and his faithfulness throughout time. And so if we can go back to those basics and ground ourselves in that truth, I think that gives us the strength and the stability and the hope to make it through really hard things and a hard life sometimes for people.
Yeah, that's really good perspective. And I wonder how many people are going through very hard things and don't understand why it's happening. And it's something all of us hit at some point. It's just part of life, and we don't get to do the zoom out and know why it's all happening. But I loved your point about that God's faithful. He's still going to be that way. He has a plan. Nothing falls out of his providence. And that's the comfort we can have as believers and the hope we can share with others. So
yeah, absolutely.
it's just, it is hard in the time where you're just searching for those answers and you don't understand. One thing I loved that you kind of hinted at, by the way, the book of Judges is a wild thing to be reading. It's kind of one of the complete craziest parts of the Bible. But one thing I love, and a topic maybe to approach a little bit, is one thing I think Scripture does really well is even in these books where it feels like maybe the overall narrative is lost. Like we get really into the weeds on genealogies, and in the book of Judges, we hear all of these stories about the crazy things going on and those judging over the land. And but the one thing you hear at the end of that book is that in those days there was no king, but everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And I think, and if I'm going to recommend one book, I think everyone should have a copy of Sally Lloyd Jones's Storybook Bible, which I think is a great way of sort of shaping Scripture as, like, even those books, even the things that you don't think are advancing narrative, even the things they are doing that. And where you can read the story of Abraham and Isaac, where, God asked for the sacrifice, and Abraham goes to do that, and how it's ultimately not required. But then, as Sally Lloyd Jones points out in the book, later on, we would see a sacrifice of a son. They would walk a hill, and that sacrifice would be made. I just think that's an awesome picture of what the gospel does for us, and it ties in the things that we don't see as like the great story that God is telling. Maybe we don't see that all the way through. Maybe we think that there are some times of history that God has been absent or not working, but we know that he is. And I think that's the comfort that we have as believers, is that the Bible is giving the story of the whole world, and it's applicable. Even something in the Old Testament that is culturally not relevant or hard to understand. I think, maybe the question out of all this is, what would you say to go read something hard to someone that they might not fully get, but if you truly invested the time into it and did just the studying of that book or of something, that you would come out with a much deeper meaning, something that is there that's meaningful. What would you say to someone to go challenge themselves in that way?
Okay. That's a great question. And two modern works immediately come into my mind. The first would be Eliot's The Wasteland, which I promise will not make one bit of sense, even with the footnotes for most of us. I've taught it several times. I'll give myself, when I first started teaching it, I would give myself a week, which was foolish. It takes much longer than that. Then I increased it to a week and a half, and it normally takes about 2 weeks or 3, because we just need to go kind of verse by verse, and we have to talk out all of it. But it's difficult. It's hard to understand. But it's the poem that's credited with sort of shaping the modern period, the ideology, the mindset, all the major themes of modern literature are embodied in the poem. It's tough. It's difficult to read, but I think it's important. And then the second would be something by Faulkner, either The Sound and the Fury or Absalom. Those are two books that I really enjoy teaching, but they're really difficult. And I tell students, just keep reading. It's so interesting that you pose the question in that way, because what I literally will say is just keep reading.
Yeah.
It will not make sense. It's not supposed to. Just keep reading. And eventually the story will kind of unfold. I also love what you said about the Bible and how the narrative, even though it may appear not to be prominent or existent at all, in some of the books, the narrative is always working. It's, if not in the forefront, it's underlying. And I think that in both of those works, in The Wasteland and in The Sound and the Fury, or all three, The Sound and the Fury and also Absalom, the narrative thread is there. And a part of, I think, the wonder of modern literature that I love so much, I love the difficulty, I love the sometimes obtuseness, and I love the mystery of having to work through the literature to understand and to kind of make sense of it. But those are works that if you'll do your due diligence, if you'll just stick with it and you'll read and study, and better to read and study with someone else so you can talk through what you're reading, I think you'll find, our students will find, that it's just invaluable.
Yeah. What's, maybe something that, what's something that maybe people wouldn't know about you?
Oh, my word. This is so silly, but I honestly can't think of anything else. People who know me well know this, but I guess what people wouldn't know is that I'm a bowling mom.
Oh, okay.
Which is weird, kind of.
Okay, explain a little bit.
So my son is a bowler.
Okay.
And he's actually a college bowler. I tell people all the time he'd be at North Greenville, but we don't have a bowling team.
Yeah.
So we need to do something about that. But he started bowling when he was, I think, 3. We came home from church one Sunday afternoon after lunch. We were channel surfing, and my husband turned the TV to ESPN, and there was a bowling tournament on TV. And I was the person who thought bowling wasn't a sport. I was like, why is this on ESPN? This is not a sport. This is silly. But he was captivated. My son was captivated. And we had to record it. And he watched this one tournament over and over and over. And he would get empty water bottles and knock them down with a ball, try to set them up like the pins. And so then eventually for Christmas, we got a little plastic set of bowling pins, and a bowling athlete was born. So we've had to learn a lot about bowling.
Yeah.
I can tell you, I can't bowl. I'm terrible at it, but I can tell you a lot about it. And we have spent a lot of time investing in bowling all over the country. And it's taken us to many states and many cities. And it's been a fun ride for us. Never saw that coming.
Has he had any perfect games? Like, was it 300?
Yes.
Yeah.
He bowled his 17th or 18th 300 a couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
18.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Okay.
Yeah.
My wife would kill me for saying this, and I mean, maybe she'll never see it, but she is the world's not best bowler.
No, I'm the worst.
I
I own
bet
the title.
Yeah, same level, but she refuses any help. And so I remember early on, I'd be like, hey, just like, let's do the bumpers. Like,
Yeah.
let's have a stress-free environment. She didn't want it, but then she would toss it straight in the gutter every single time. And I'm
That's
like,
me.
And then she would just leave very frustrated. And I'm like, this could have been a more fun date. But yeah. Oh, wow. I mean,
Yeah.
I've known some competitive bowlers, but that's it. 18 perfect games. That's pretty impressive.
We've learned a lot. It's been a fun ride. It's been a good journey for us. It's a good community. We've really enjoyed it.
That's awesome. Well, we appreciate your time. I'm going to ask you one question. For someone that's, navigating maybe a degree in English, maybe they're exploring some new ideas, some new topics. What are some things that they can be doing to, how should they? We've talked about how you can challenge yourself reading literature, but what are some things that you should be doing in the classroom setting? Like, how can students be a part of one another's lives in a way that's super helpful for the kind of understanding that needs to come from pursuing a degree like that? What are some things that maybe you've seen in your classes that have been super helpful to create an environment where it's been helpful for students and given them a lot of opportunities?
Yeah, I think students supporting each other, students who are struggling, not being ashamed of that and asking for help and accepting and receiving help from their classmates. I particularly enjoy writing classes because in our upper level writing classes, especially where we sort of have the bandwidth to do this, in fiction and nonfiction writing classes, we typically have workshops where students are able to get feedback from one another, and that process tears down barriers. It removes intimidation that students might feel. Oh, this person is a stronger student than I am, or I'm reluctant to read in front of this person. And what happens is they help each other, and as they're helping one another in workshops, discussing what's strong and what can be strengthened and where they can work some more on a writing project. As they're doing that, the individual student who's helping someone else is learning to read better, read his or her own writing better, edit his or her own writing better. So building community in the class where students are not intimidated, where they are not reluctant to go to each other and ask for help and to support one another, I think is very beneficial. I love that moment when you see a group of students who maybe none of them knew each other before, but that moment where they come together and they sort of become a team, mm-hmm. and they start working together and they're working to help each other. And organically, oftentimes what happens is they'll create a text feed, or they'll create some type of online group where they're working even outside of class together to help each other out. So I just encourage students, get to know your classmates. It's really important. Don't isolate. Don't feel like you have to do this on your own. Get to know your classmates. Ask for help. Also, I think all of us encourage them. I tell students all the time, we're here because this is where God called us, and we love teaching, but we love interacting with students. We want to help you. We want to build relationships with you. Ask questions. If you're struggling, let us know how we can help you, and then connecting students to their classmates, to other people who can also be a help to them, builds that. Mostly, we just want that bonding to happen. And the hope is that when they leave this place in 4 years, they will have a group of friends, not just their friends in the dorm and roommates and other activities, but friends that they've made in the classroom, in and outside of their majors, that they know that, we're lifelong friends and we can always be there for each other.